The storm came out of nowhere, a wall of white swallowing the highway, the kind of cold that bites through bone. Somewhere in that chaos, 9 roaring bikes went silent, stranded in the middle of nowhere. Miles away, an old black farmer stood at his window, watching the snow bury his land. He didn't know that before the night was over, he'd open his door to men society told him to fear. The Hells Angels. What happened next would shatter every stereotype, every expectation, and forge a bond no one saw coming. It was the winter of 1983 in rural Montana, where the fields stretched farther than the eye could see, and neighbors were few and far between. Henry Cole had lived on that land his entire life, a quiet black farmer in his late 50s, known for keeping to himself and working from dawn until the sky bled orange. His farm was simple, a creaking barn, a few cows, and the memories of a wife long gone. The townsfolk respected him from a distance, though whispers followed him. The kind of whispers that remind you you're still different, no matter how many winters you've survived among them. That week, the weather forecast had promised a light snow. By nightfall, it was a whiteout, a blizzard so fierce that even the animals huddled in fear. Henry stacked wood by the stove, preparing for a long night, when the low rumble of engines cut through the storm. At first, he thought he imagined it. Who would be out here in weather like this? But the sound grew louder, closer, until headlights glowed faintly through the swirling snow. When the noise suddenly stopped, silence fell heavy again. Henry hesitated, peering through the frost-bitten glass. Out there, somewhere on that frozen road, someone was stranded, maybe more than one. He could have stayed inside, safe and warm, but something in him wouldn't allow it. Grabbing his coat, lantern, and an old army blanket, he stepped into the storm. He didn't yet know that 9 men, bikers with leather jackets, tattoos, and a reputation that frightened most, were out there fighting for their lives. And before the sun rose again, those same men would be fighting for him. The wind howled like a living thing as Henry trudged forward, his boots sinking deep into the snow. The beam of his lantern flickered, catching the faint outline of motorcycles half buried in white chrome glinting beneath the frost. Then he saw them. 9 figures huddled together, leather jackets stiff with ice, their faces raw from the cold. For a moment, they looked less like the fearsome Hells Angels he'd heard about on the news and more like lost boys, swallowed by the storm. "Anyone alive?" he shouted over the wind, though the words were nearly stolen away. A few lifted their heads weakly. Henry didn't hesitate. He helped one man to his feet, then another, guiding them back toward the faint glow of his farmhouse through the blizzard's fury. Inside, the warmth hit them like a miracle. Steam rose from their clothes as they crowded near the wood stove, shaking and silent. Henry didn't ask questions. He simply poured hot coffee, handed out blankets, and watched as color slowly returned to their faces. The oldest among them, a burly man with frost on his beard and a leather vest heavy with patches, gave him a look Henry couldn't quite read. It wasn't gratitude yet. It was confusion, suspicion. Outside, the storm raged harder. The roads were gone, the phones dead, the world sealed off in white. For the first time in years, Henry wasn't alone, but the air was thick, uneasy. The men whispered among themselves, their tattoos gleaming under the lantern light. He could feel their eyes on him, measuring, wondering why an old black farmer had risked his life for them. Henry knew what they were thinking, because he'd seen that look before. The small-town stares, the sideways glances in diners, the questions that never needed asking. To them, he was different. And yet, here they were, warmed by his fire, alive because he'd opened his door. Hours passed. The storm showed no mercy. The men grew restless, pacing the wooden floor, sometimes muttering about their bikes, their gear, their bad luck. But slowly, something shifted. One of them, a younger man with a scar down his cheek, offered to chop wood for the stove. Another fed the animals in the barn without being asked. Henry didn't say much, but inside, he felt something unfamiliar, a fragile bridge forming between worlds that were never meant to meet. Outside, the wind screamed against the farmhouse walls. Inside, 9 bikers and 1 farmer shared the same fire. None of them knew that by morning, the real storm wouldn't be the one outside. It would be what came after. When dawn finally broke, the storm had calmed, leaving behind a world buried under silence and snow. The men stepped outside, their boots crunching on the frozen ground, surveying what was left of their bikes. Some were half buried, others completely frozen over. The road was gone. They weren't going anywhere for a long while. Henry helped them dig, his breath visible in the cold air, moving steadily beside men who looked like they'd never lifted a shovel for anyone else. There was no talk, only the sound of metal scraping ice. And then, just as they started clearing the path, a pickup truck rolled up from down the road, the sheriff's truck. Henry stiffened. The sheriff climbed out, hand already near his holster, his gaze landing on the men and their bikes. Then on Henry. "What's this, Cole?" the sheriff called out. "You running some kind of gang house now?" The words hung heavy in the cold. The bikers froze, the tension crackling like static. The sheriff's tone carried the same poison Henry had known his whole life, the kind that didn't need to be shouted to cut deep. Henry kept his voice calm. They were stranded. Storm hit hard, just trying to keep them alive. But the sheriff didn't hear compassion, only defiance. He took a step closer, eyes narrowing. "You expect me to believe that?" For a second, no one moved. Then the leader of the Hell's Angels, the burly man with the frostbitten beard, stepped forward, placing himself between Henry and the sheriff. His leather vest caught the pale light, patches gleaming like battle scars. "He saved our lives," he said, voice low but unshakable. "You got a problem with him? You got a problem with us?" The sheriff's eyes flicked between them. 1 old black farmer, 9 outlaw bikers. He hesitated, spat into the snow, and finally turned back to his truck. "You boys best clear out when the road's open," he muttered. Then he drove away. Henry watched in silence, the air still heavy but different now. For the first time, someone else had stood between him and the hate he'd faced all his life. When the sheriff's truck disappeared down the snowy road, the air finally loosened. The storm had broken, but something else had shifted, something deeper than snow or fear. The bikers went back to work beside Henry, helping him clear the path, feeding his livestock, fixing a broken fence, even repairing his old tractor with tools pulled from their saddlebags. What began as survival had become respect. They stayed 2 more days, sleeping on floors and hay bales, eating Henry's cornbread and stew, laughing in the quiet way of men who'd seen too much. They listened when he spoke about the land, about working hard, about how kindness doesn't ask who you are first. When the roads finally opened, their engines roared back to life. The leader, the one who'd stood up to the sheriff, shook Henry's hand with both of his rough palms trembling. "You ever need anything," he said, "you call us. Doesn't matter where you are." Henry just smiled, unsure he'd ever take them up on it. Months passed. The snow melted, spring rolled in, and Henry returned to his routines. Until one night, someone spray-painted racial slurs across his barn. It wasn't the first time, but it cut just as deep. Before he could clean it off, engines echoed down his driveway. 9 bikes stopped in a line. The same men stepped off, silent, and began painting over the words themselves. No one in town bothered Henry again after that. The message was clear. The man who'd once stood alone in a storm now had brothers watching over him. Years later, after Henry passed, a small wooden cross stood by the edge of his farm. Every winter, tire tracks appeared in the snow, and 9 red roses were laid beneath his name. Sometimes, kindness doesn't echo in words. It roars back in the sound of engines. And maybe that's the real question this story leaves us with. How different would the world be if we all helped a stranger, even the ones we were taught to fear?